Welcome to Truly Scary Ouija Stories. Smash like and subscribe to tread the thin line between reality and the surreal. Let's begin our eerie expedition.
It was supposed to be just another Friday night. Meaningless college rituals, a few misplaced whispers about paranormal games, and nights that stretched into forgettable memories. But as I stood in the dusty basement of Harrington Hall, the room dimly lit by nothing but an old string of fairy lights, I could feel the texture of every shadow, taste the dusty thrill of superstition in the air. That was the night we found the Ouija board. Mark, with his usual flair for the dramatic, was the one who unearthed it behind a pile of forgotten janitorial supplies. "Guys, look what we've got here," he called out, his voice a mixture of amusement and mischief. As we gathered around, the wooden board seemed innocuous enough, its surface scratched and the letters faded from age. None of us could have guessed how much it would change everything. "Let's give it a go," Mark said, glancing around at us. Sarah shivered, half in excitement, half in fear, clutching her oversized sweater closer as if it could protect her from unseen forces. Lily hesitated, her brow furrowed in doubt. "Why not?" I chimed in, more out of a challenge to my own skepticism than any belief in the supernatural. "It's just a game, right?" So we huddled around the small table Mark had dragged to the center of the room, the Ouija board set before us like an ancient artifact. Mark volunteered as the first medium, with Sarah eagerly joining him. Their fingers lightly touched the wooden planchette, their faces a mixture of anticipation and fear. As the shadows danced on the walls, the first question was thrown into the darkness. "Is anyone there?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper, yet thick with expectancy. The planchette stirred, sliding with a life of its own towards yes. Sarah gasped, her eyes wide with fear and fascination, while Mark's grin widened. "It's probably just the uneven table," Lily muttered, but her voice was tinged with doubt. Our questions began simply, queries met with playful answers. But as the night deepened, the air in the basement grew inexplicably colder, and the responses became strangely specific, mentioning things only we could know. It was as if the past had folded into the present, whispering secrets meant to remain forgotten. In that eerie glow of fairy lights, with the edges of reality seemingly blurred, we should have stopped. We should have discerned the warning veiled in the chilling air and the two knowing answers. But curiosity, as it often does, lured us deeper into the shadows we had no business exploring. The uneasy mirth that had started our adventure began to sour, morphing into a tension that twined around each of us like ivy. Our laughter diminished, replaced by tight smiles as we continued to press the board for answers. Whose invisible hands guided the planchette now? "Who are you?" I found myself asking, my voice a mix of fear and defiance. The planchette moved swiftly, more assured than before, spelling out a friend. But the atmosphere told a different story. It was heavy, thick with the scent of old dust and something unspoken. The fun had drained from Mark's face, replaced by a flicker of something dark. Curiosity, or perhaps fear. Sarah's hands trembled on the planchette, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned in closer, her eyes fixed on the letters as though they could spring to life. "Did you die here?" she asked, her voice barely audible. The planchette hesitated, then slid with purpose across the board, spelling out no. Not a restless spirit of the hall, then, but something else, something that wasn't bound to this place alone. A deep chill swept through the room, as if in warning. Lily, previously quiet, finally spoke, her voice sharp. "Ask it something else, something it can't know unless it really is something supernatural." Mark nodded, his usual bravado slipping slightly. "Okay, how did Jane Doe die?" He used the pseudonym of our friend who had died the previous year, a topic we hadn't spoken of in months, not since the police had closed it as an accident. We all held our breath as the planchette started moving again. "Heart," it began, and my heart raced with the echo of each letter. "A tta sake," it finished. Silence enveloped us. No one spoke, the only sound our collective shallow breaths. "That's wrong," Lily finally muttered, her face pale. "She died in a car accident," she added, a thin veil of confusion and fear settling over her features. "Maybe it's just nonsense," I suggested, trying not to let my own dread color my words too darkly. But the seeds of doubt were planted. The planchette vibrated beneath Sarah's and Mark's fingers, then slid with sudden force to spell out one final word before we could react. Betrayal. The word hung between us, a sinister shadow stretching over our circle. The flickering fairy light seemed to dim, casting long, twisted shadows against the walls. Who, if any of us, could the spirit mean? The accusation was a spectral dagger among us, and I could see the suspicion creeping into every crease of Mark's, Lily's, and Sarah's faces. We sat frozen, the ominous word betrayal echoing in our minds like a sinister whisper. The room had grown colder, if that was even possible, and the tension among us was palpable. None dared to speak, each lost in their swirling thoughts, pondering the accusation hurled by an unseen force. Without a word, Sarah pulled her fingers from the planchette, wrapping her arms around herself as if to ward off a chill that had sunk deep into her bones. The abrupt departure of her touch seemed to break the spell, and the rest of us retracted our hands too, as if the board had suddenly turned red hot. "I think that's enough for tonight," Lily said, her voice quivering slightly. Her earlier skepticism had vanished, replaced by a frightened realization that some stones are better left unturned. We packed up the board in silence, each of us avoiding the other's gaze, the word betrayal echoing in the empty air. The drive to bond over secrets and spirits had dissolved into distrust, and without speaking, we parted ways. That night, haunted by the evening's revelations, sleep eluded me. The darkness of my room felt oppressive, charged with a whispered menace. I tossed and turned, my dreams infiltrated by shadowy figures and whispered threats. The following days were no better. Shadows seemed sharper, and every creak of my old dorm room sent chills down my spine. Texts to the group remained unanswered, and our once tight-knit circle fractured under the weight of unspoken accusations and fear. Driven by a desperate need for closure, I returned to the basement alone one evening, the board under my arm. The room was just as we had left it, the dread I'd felt still lingering like a foul odor. Setting up the board, I swallowed my fear and placed my fingers lightly on the planchette. "Are you still there?" I asked, my voice a mix of dread and defiance. Silence. The planchette didn't stir, and the oppressive stillness of the room grew unbearable. Minutes stretched into what seemed like hours. Finally, I stood, the realization dawning on me with chilling clarity. The Ouija board had been a catalyst, not the cause. We had called something from the shadows that night, something that had lingered long after the board was put away. Our fears, our secrets, these were the things that haunted us, perhaps had always haunted us. I left the board in the basement, a silent sentinel of the night's horrors. As I ascended the stairs, the weight of that night's revelations hung heavy on my shoulders. In seeking answers from the unknown, we had invited these torments into our lives, played with forces we did not understand. In the quiet of my lonely walk back, the whisper of the word betrayal seemed to be carried on the wind, a reminder that some doors, once opened, might never be closed. The veil between doubt and insanity was thinner than I had ever imagined. And under the cloak of night, it was clear that the true horror wasn't the spirits we had awakened, but the secrets that walked among us, haunting us from within.
There's a certain chill that clings to the air of a house marked by tragedy, an almost imperceptible whisper threaded through the drone of casual conversation and laughter. That chill soaked through my bones as I stepped through the threshold of the old Whitmore place, a house as notorious in our small town as the ill-fated family it once sheltered. "Halloween spirit, right?" Emma chuckled, her arm linked through mine as if she could steady the unease that fluttered like caged birds in my stomach. I wasn't here for spirits, Halloween or otherwise. I came because Emma asked, because after all these years, I still found it impossible to say no to those vibrant green eyes and wild, curly red hair that seemed to capture the very essence of her untamed spirit. The party was in full swing, bodies moving through the dimly lit rooms decorated with artificial cobwebs and skeletal motifs that seemed almost mocking in their festivity. Laughter danced around the edges of my consciousness, but it was the disquiet whispering through the drafty halls that held my attention. As the night crept onward, the room hushed, all gathered around an old, weathered Ouija board. Mark, usually the stoic type, shot me a dubious glance as he handed me a beer, its cold surface a stark contrast to the warmth of the room. "Don't get too spooked," he teased, but his eyes betrayed his own skepticism. I settled beside Emma and a few others from around town, the Ouija board resting like a dormant threat at our center. Emma, ever the enthusiast, instructed, "Place your fingers lightly on the planchette. Let's invite any spirits present to communicate with us. Remember, no pushing." The ambiance dipped, the playful atmosphere curdling into something thick and anxious as the planchette twitched beneath our collective touch. Emma's voice was a soothing melody in the charged air. "Spirit, are you here with us tonight?" Silence, a beat of nothing, and then a slow, almost hesitant glide of the planchette towards yes. A collective intake of breath tightened the room, eyes wide and fixed on the ancient board. "Spirit, what is your name?" Emma continued, her voice a mix of awe and reverence. The planchette moved with alarming precision, spelling out Elliot, Elliot. A shiver cascaded down my spine, the room suddenly colder, the shadows darker. "Are you the spirit of someone who lived here?" Someone else asked, their voice barely above a whisper. "No," the board replied swiftly, chillingly definitive. The flicker of candles reflected like distant lighthouses in the stormy sea of Mark's pupils as he leaned closer, skepticism momentarily forgotten amidst the unfolding mystery. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice a tether back to reality. The planchette's movement was deliberate, chilling in its clarity as it spelled out a simple, yet haunting reply, Jude. Every gaze in the room turned towards me, their expressions a mix of horror and curiosity, as powerful as the cold wind that suddenly swept through the room, extinguishing candles and leaving us veiled in semi-darkness. The room felt less like a haven of festive spirit, and more a portal to something ancient, something that had noticed me far more than I desired. In the thickening gloom, Emma hastily relit a candle, her hands trembling, casting quivering shadows across the walls. "It's just a game, right, Jude?" she whispered, her voice a thin veil over her mounting fear. I nodded, though every instinct screamed that this was no game. Not anymore. The atmosphere was charged, heavy with an unseen presence. The next morning, under the stark, unforgiving light of day, the dread of the previous night should have diminished. It didn't. At my desk, the mundane glow of the computer screen couldn't dispel the chill that had settled deep in my bones. My coffee went cold as I scoured the internet for any mention of an Elliot connected to the old Whitmore house, but found nothing. The logical part of my mind clung to the hope that it was just a prank, a careful orchestration by Emma to spice up the party. Yet, the realist in me doubted. Emma was many things, but deceitful she was not. As the day dragged on, small, inexplicable incidents began to fray my nerves. Papers would go missing only to reappear where I had already checked. Faint whispers, unintelligible and soft, seemed to echo through the empty hallways of my home. Each odd occurrence twisted the knot of anxiety tighter. That night, shadows in my dreams twisted into dark, whispering silhouettes, all chanting, "Jude, Jude, Jude," in an unnerving litany. Fueled by a mix of fear and stubbornness, I returned to the Whitmore house. The door protested with a screech as I pushed into the now abandoned revelry room. Dust particles danced like mocking specters in the beam of my flashlight as I ascended to the attic, a place untouched by the party's gaiety. Here lay boxes of forgotten belongings, piled haphazardly. In the furthest corner, beneath a draped, moth-eaten cloth, I found an old, leather-bound diary. Its cover was coated in a thick layer of dust, the name Elliot Whitmore embossed faintly on the surface. My hands trembled as I paged through the diary. Every written word confirmed my growing horror. Elliot had been a medium, one who had delved too deeply into the afterworld, contacting spirits without regard for the consequences. His entries grew increasingly erratic, a descent into madness laid bare on the yellowing pages. His last entry was a frantic scribbled warning. "It lies. It is not what it claims. Beware the binding." The setting sun cast long shadows through the attic window just as I read the final words. A sudden chill swept through the room, carrying with it a whispered echo of my name, drawing out the syllables in a hiss. The diary fell from my numb fingers, pages fluttering to rest open at the warning, as if underscored by an unseen hand. The mounting dread solidified into icy terror. This was no mere ghost. This was something much older and more malicious. An entity that knew me, that wanted something from me, something far more sinister than mere communication. Determined to sever whatever bond this Elliot had forged during our Ouija session, I resolved to confront it directly. The weight of the old diary in my bag felt like a totem as I urged myself back to the site of that fateful party. Night had cloaked the town in darkness by the time I arrived at the Whitmore house, my determination faltering for a heartbeat as the house loomed ominously before me. With trembling hands, I retrieved the Ouija board left behind in the rush of last night's abrupt end. I set it up in the exact spot we had played, the pale moonlight barely threading through the grimy windows to illuminate the letters. "Elliot," I called into the shadows, "I know what you are. This ends tonight." The air grew colder, the silence of the house deepening until it was shattered by a sudden gust that slammed doors and rattled the windows. The planchette twitched, then slid with purpose across the board, spelling out, "Too late." Rage and fear vied for dominance as I faced the dark corner of the room. "No," I countered loudly, my voice steady despite the trembling of my hands. "I will not be bound to you." Reaching into my bag, I pulled out Elliot's diary, turning to the page marked by his final warning. Below, in desperate scrawl, were etched the words of a binding release, a chant intended to break ties with the spirits. With each spoken word, the room darkened, and the shadows seemed to draw inward, tightening around me like a noose. The planchette whirled across the board in a frenzy, accompanied by a howl that seemed to shake the foundations of the house. "Stop!" the board spelled out, but I continued, the ancient words feeling almost alive on my tongue. As I reached the climax of the chant, a force pushed against me, as tangible as a gust of wind, yet as impenetrable as iron. I stumbled but did not fall, my resolve anchored by every memory of fear the spirit had instilled in me. With a final defiant shout, I completed the chant. Silence crashed down with such finality that my ears rang. The oppressive presence, the chill, the sense of being watched, all evaporated in an instant, leaving behind only the musty, unremarkable scent of an old house long left vacant. Exhausted and shaken, I packed up the Ouija board, slipping Elliot's diary back into my bag. The moon was a thin crescent in the sky as I stepped out of the Whitmore house, its door closing with a soft click behind me. Relief was palpable in my breath, visible in the mist that curled from my lips in the cool night air. However, as I approached my car, a cold breeze whispered through the trees and a shiver trailed down my spine. I paused, a lingering dread blossoming anew. Was it truly over, or had I merely placated something biding its time? As the night swallowed up the image of the Whitmore house in my rearview mirror, I realized some doors, once opened, may never be fully closed. Whether Elliot was gone for good, or merely retreated into the shadows, I understood then that some remnants of our past hauntings linger, waiting for us in the quiet moments, whispering our names in the wind.
As the snow whispered secrets to the graying skies, the old wooden cabin appeared almost inviting, with its warm light spilling onto the freshly powdered ground. Inside, the laughter and crackling fire contrasted sharply with the tempest brewing outside. It was the first night of our reunion in years, and despite time and distance, the familiarity of old friendships wrapped around us, like the quilt draped over the worn sofa. It was there, amidst conversations laden with nostalgia, that Mark made his peculiar discovery. "Hey, check this out," he called from the attic, his voice echoing slightly through the wooden beams. We gathered around him as he descended, a dusty Ouija board in his hands, its letters faded but legible, the planchette jittering slightly with every step he took. Found it tucked behind some old books. Thought it might be fun, like old times. Mark's eyes sparkled with mischief, although a hint of unease seemed to flicker just beneath the surface. Sarah, ever the skeptic, chuckled, brushing a curl from her eyes. "Yeah, fun. Nothing like summoning spirits in a storm to really start a party, right?" Her tone was light, mocking, but her gaze drifted to the board with an intensity that betrayed her curiosity. Deciding to indulge in the eerie ambiance the storm provided, I was the one to place the board gently on the thick oak table in the center of the room. We all sat, our knees bumping awkwardly under the table, the fire casting flickering shadows against our faces. As a joke, I suggested we turn off the lights, relying only on the firelight to see. The flames danced across our eyes as we each placed 2 fingers on the planchette. "Is there anyone there who wishes to speak to us?" Emily asked, her voice a mix of feigned solemnity and real anticipation. The planchette trembled, a subtle, almost imperceptible quake, but then, decisively, it dragged our hands across the smooth surface to settle firmly on yes. A collective nervous laugh broke out, tinged with excitement and fear. We looked around, eyes wide, the reality of our engagement with something unknown, something potentially beyond our comprehension, starting to sink in. "Who are you?" Mark ventured, his voice now lacking its usual buoyancy. The planchette stalled, and for a moment, all that could be heard was the howl of the wind, as if it were trying to whisper through the cracks in the timbers, urging caution. Then it moved again with purpose and direction, spelling out slowly, PACT. The word hung heavily in the air, thick with implications that none of us fully understood yet. The lightness of our initial curiosity began to compact into a dense, unsettling dread. We stared at each other, the flickering light painting our faces with ghostly expressions. We had unwittingly opened a door. Now all that remained was to see what would come through. As the silence deepened around the word pact, it was Sarah who finally broke the stillness. "What pact? Are you referring to something specific?" Her voice, usually calm and controlled, betrayed a spike of fear. We waited, breaths held, as the planchette started to move again. It dragged our fingertips across the board, spellbindingly slow to spell long ago. Confusion mixed with an unspoken fear began to permeate the room. Emily whispered, almost to herself, "Long ago? What does it mean? Did we ever?" Her voice trailed off, lost in a sea of forgotten memories. But before anyone could respond, a cold draft swept through the room. The fire flickered wildly, casting unnerving shadows that seemed to loom closer. Mark, trying to inject some humor into the growing tension, joked uneasily, "Well, it doesn't seem like we made a pact with a kindly spirit. Maybe a discount poltergeist from our college days remembered us?" No one laughed. Julie, always the most adventurous among us, pressed further, urging a bit tremulously, "What do you want from us?" Her usual boldness dimmed by the chill that had settled deep in our bones. This time, the response came faster, the planchette eagerly rushing towards the letters, spelling out an answer like a dark whisper. The pact fulfilled. A heavy thud outside, as if something substantial had fallen into the snow, jerked our heads towards the windows. Nothing but the blizzard's swirling fury was visible. Turning back, we found the planchette had moved by itself to the figure of the sun in the corner of the board, a symbol often representing completion or fulfillment. Panic started to claw at my chest, an icy grip that tightened with each heartbeat. "This isn't right," I muttered, more to myself than to anyone else. We need to stop this. We need to say goodbye." But before we could slide the planchette to goodbye, it jerked away under our fingers, moving with an assertive force we hadn't felt before. It spelled out 2 more words, "Too late." The wind howled like a mournful specter outside, mirroring the chaos unfurling inside. The room temperature plummeted further, our breath fogging in the air as if the storm itself had invaded the indoors. Fear, palpable and sharp, filled the cabin. We were trapped, isolated by the snow, and something far more sinister that had been invited into our circle, a forgotten jest turned nightmare. We stood abruptly, the chairs scraping loudly against the wooden floor, breaking the ominous connection with the board. Emily rounded on Sarah, her blue eyes wide and shining with unshed tears. "What have we done, Sarah? What did we agree to all those years ago?" Sarah's face was pale, her usual composure shattered as she tried to recall any detail of their past Ouija sessions, but nothing surfaced. The realization that our shared memories held no answers was perhaps the most terrifying revelation of all. The cacophony of the storm outside matched the turmoil within as we paced the cabin, trying to formulate a plan. Every shadow seemed darker, every creak of the cabin more ominous than before. Desperation gnawed at the edges of reason. Mark spoke up, his voice rough with tension. "Look, we have to figure this out. There has to be a way to end this. Does anyone remember anything about a pact? Anything at all?" We racked our brains, summoning distant memories of laughter and dare-driven nights, but nothing substantial surfaced. Julie turned to the Ouija board again, determination set in her jaw. We have to ask it how to break the pact. It's our only shot. Reluctantly, we all gathered once more, the fire now low, casting more shadows than light. We hovered over the board, a palpable dread settling over us as our fingers touched the planchette. "How do we break the pact?" Julie demanded, her voice a mix of fear and defiance. The planchette's movement was sluggish, almost reluctant. It moved in a slow, deliberate spiral before it spelled out, "Sacrifice 1." The words struck us like a physical blow, eyes wide, hearts pounding sharply against ribs too constrictive to hold our fear. "No," Sarah whispered, the skeptic within her crumbling under the weight of undeniable reality. "We won't do that. We can't." Mark looked from face to face, seeing the horror reflected in each. There has got to be another way. There always is. But the storm raged louder, as if mocking our plight, the wind howling through cracks like the wails of the damned. Another glance at the board, and we knew it was unyielding. "Sacrifice 1" remained permanently etched onto the wooden surface, as if carved by an unseen hand. The hours that followed were filled with frantic discussion, tears, and harsh whispers. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning, as the first hints of dawn tinged the horizon with gray, that Emily stood up, her face eerily calm. "I'll do it," she said quietly, an unsettling peace in her tone that chilled the rest of us to the bone. "I've always believed in the supernatural more than any of you. Maybe it's fitting that I'm the one." "No, Emily, we can't let you do this," I protested, but she silenced me with a sad smile. "It's okay. Maybe this way, it'll leave the rest of you alone. Maybe the pact will be fulfilled." Her decision haunted us, but in our deepest selves, tainted by fear and desperation, we were relieved. The ritual was simple and horrific, the details of which I buried deep in the shadows of my mind. When it was done, the silence that enveloped the cabin was more oppressive than the raging storm had ever been. Emily was gone. The planchette no longer moved, no matter how much we called to it in whispers and shouts. But even as the sun rose, casting light over a landscape serene and untouched by the horrors of the night, the weight of our sacrifice pressed down on us, suffocating, relentless. We left the cabin as soon as we could, the board left behind, untouched, cursed. My friends and I have never been the same since that night. We speak rarely, and when we do, it's never of what happened. But the guilt weighs heavy, a constant companion, and I still wonder at night if Emily's spirit finds us culpable. In quiet moments, when the wind howls just right, I swear I can still hear her voice, carried on the breeze, whispering truths I'm too afraid to face. And I wonder if the pact was truly fulfilled, or if it merely waits, biding its time for another storm, another night, to claim what remains of a forgotten jest.
I've always been the skeptic. Ghost stories, supernatural phenomena, psychic predictions, I'd wave them all off as distractions for the weak-minded. But there's something inherently unsettling about a storm-whipped night, especially when you're holed up in an old, creaking lakeside cabin that begins to gnaw at even the sternest disbelief. This was supposed to be our last hurrah, a final weekend together before adulthood swept us into its relentless current. 5 college graduates clinging to the frayed edges of youth within the wooden walls of a family cabin that belonged to Emily's grandparents. Nestled by Lake Mara, it was isolated, encircled by towering pines that swayed and groaned under the weight of the wind, and it was perfect. Under the dull glow of old lanterns, while the rain pelted the windows like gravel, Emily pulled out an antiquated Ouija board she'd found in the attic. The board was an eerie relic, its letters faded and the wood seasoned by countless fingertips. "Let's give this a go," she said with a mischievous glint in her eye, her red curls bouncing as she set it on the worn coffee table. Despite my protests, logical reasons spouted about the irrationality of such games. Curiosity, that unyielding human trait, took over the others. Mark, always up for a laugh, was the first to join. "Come on, David, don't be such a bore," he chuckled, his sandy hair falling into his eyes as he plopped down beside Emily. It wasn't long before the others settled around the board, their fingers lightly touching the wooden planchette. "Is there anyone here with us?" Emily asked the darkness, her voice a mix of feigned solemnity and genuine curiosity. The wind howled in response, the cabin groaning as if burdened by secrets. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the planchette began to glide across the board. It felt like an age passed as it moved jerkily from letter to letter. A cold draft swept through the room and the candles flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. M-A-R-A, Mark read aloud, hesitating mid-chuckle, the amusement draining from his face. A tension, palpable and chilling, filled the air. Before I could interject with rational explanations, the room seemed to grow colder, the shadows deeper. "Who is Mara?" asked Jenna, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes wide and shining with a mix of fear and fascination. The planchette resumed its eerie drift across the board, the wood beneath it creaking softly. "Drowned," it spelled out, the message stark and unsettling amid the staccato rhythm of the rain against the windows. And just like that, the playful atmosphere curdled into something far graver. The game had ceased to be a game. The lines between jest and reality blurred as old fears and stories about drowned spirits haunting Lake Mara surfaced in our minds. My heart raced, a skeptic's heart, unaccustomed to the tremors of irrational fear. But still I remained, my hands clutched in my lap, my eyes fixed on the board, as the storm outside raged, indifferent to the storm brewing within. The silence that hung over us was abruptly shattered when the planchette jerked toward no, as Jenna tried to end the session. "We should stop," she insisted, her voice a shaken whisper, but Mara, or whatever claimed to be Mara, wasn't having it. The word no was articulated with a force that seemed to push back against Jenna's fingertips, the wooden piece practically zipping across the board. Emily argued that we should respect the spirit's wishes. A heated discussion erupted between her and Mark, who now appeared visibly shaken and eager to break ties with the board. My own skepticism battled with the creeping dread that slithered like cold mist through my bones. Rational thoughts clashed with the unexplainable events unfolding, tethering my curiosity to the dimly lit room despite every instinct screaming for departure. The wind's howling crescendo seemed to mirror our rising panic. Suddenly, all candles extinguished in unison, as if snuffed out by an impatient breath. Darkness enveloped us. The cabin plunged into an opaque blackness that felt thick, almost suffocating. My heart hammered against my ribs, fighting the stillness that amplified every small sound into a cacophony of ominous whispers. In the stifling dark, senses heightened. The atmosphere thickened with the sound of our collective breaths, and another, subtler layer, a whisper. Not just the wind, but a soft, sibilant voice that seemed to curl around us. "You are mine," it hissed, a statement that scuttled across my skin like cold, nimble fingers. Frozen in place, we listened as soft footsteps padded across the wooden floor. The sound circled the table, pausing behind each of us as if inspecting its new claims. No one dared move. Even Mark's usually irreverent tone was replaced by a breath-held silence. The footsteps stopped, and the oppressive presence seemed to withdraw, the room suddenly feeling emptier, colder. With trembling hands, Mark scrambled for his phone, his earlier bravado drowned in palpable fear. He managed to flick on the flashlight, casting stark, trembling shadows against the walls. We looked at each other, faces pale and eyes wide, a silent agreement passing between us that no one would be sleeping tonight. Whatever skepticism had lingered was washed away by the raw, unfiltered fear that Mara had instilled in us, a fear that clung like damp to our thoughts. In a desperate, unspoken consensus, we huddled together, waiting for the dawn, listening to the storm's howl intermingle with the faint whispers that seemed to echo through the cracks and crevices of the old cabin. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound a signal of something unseen, drawing ever closer in the darkness. As the first pale rays of dawn bled through the storm clouds, the oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly, allowing us to breathe a bit easier, though the shadows still tugged at the edges of our vision. We packed our belongings in near silence, the air thick with unspoken fears and unanswered questions. Each creak of the floorboards, each sigh of the wind seemed pregnant with menace. No one mentioned the board. It was quietly placed back in its forgotten nook in the attic, a non-verbal pact to never disturb it again. The ride back was a quiet one, each of us lost in our thoughts, replaying the events of the night. There was an unspoken understanding that what had transpired was beyond our comprehension, beyond the scope of mere coincidence or playful trickery. The echoes of Mara's whispers seemed to follow us, a ghostly linger in the air that wasn't confined to the musty walls of the old cabin. Days turned into weeks, and we attempted to resume normalcy, but the shadows had stretched too long into our lives for things to return to how they were. After our encounter, Emily moved away without much explanation. Her messages became sparse. Mark delved into researching spiritual occurrences, a shadow of his former carefree self. Jenna contacted me occasionally, her voice always tinged with a nervous tension that hadn't been there before. As for me, my skepticism had crumbled like the walls of a long-sieged fortress. Shadows lingered a little longer. Whispers in the stillness of the night seemed too articulate. Reflections in standing water showed distortions not entirely accountable by the physics of light. In puddles, in the lake during solitary visits, a girl's face sometimes appeared, staring back with hollow eyes. One night, unable to sleep, I returned to the lake, drawn by a mix of fear and an inexplicable yearning. The water was still, a perfect mirror under the moonlight. As I watched, a mist formed over the surface, and the figure of a girl emerged, her features blurred but unmistakably sad. "You are still mine," she whispered, her voice a meld of the wind and the waves. That's when I truly understood. The game had never ended. We had been played from the moment we touched the planchette. Mara had not just communicated, she had claimed us. Her presence is woven into the fabric of our existence, an unending whisper in the chaos of our lives. Years have passed, but the echo of that night lingers. Through therapy and attempts at spiritual cleansing, the edge of terror has dulled, but it never truly leaves. It lurks in the periphery of my vision, in the silent moments of solitude, a reminder of the depth of the unseen world and the price of curiosity. Mara is a part of us now, a shadow tied to our spirits, an eerie whisper across the veil that one day, I fear, will call us back to the lake, one by one. I never believed in ghosts, not until the wind whispered secrets not meant for the living. It was a chilly October evening, and I had been coerced into attending Sarah's infamous Halloween bash, notorious for its spine-chilling themes and uncanny ability to make skeptics squirm. This year, the thrill was promised to be heightened by an old Ouija board Sarah found in her attic, a relic that smelled of mothballs and mystery. The house was a Victorian-era relic, draped liberally in cobwebs, synthetic, I assumed, and dimly lit with flickering jack-o'-lanterns. Laughter and eerie music floated through the rooms as shadows danced on the walls, mocking the living with their silent, jerky movements. Sarah, in her flapper dress adorned with too many sequins, grabbed my arm as I entered, her excitement bubbling over like the cauldron in the corner. "Evan! You're just in time! We're about to start the Ouija board session," she squealed, pulling me toward the attic stairs before I could protest. Reluctantly, I followed, skepticism my shield against the creeping dread that seemed all too eager to crawl up my spine. The attic was a stark contrast to the festive atmosphere below. Dust motes danced in the beams of old lanterns, and the air was thick with the musk of forgotten things. Sarah and our friends, Mark and a few others, gathered around a small table where the Ouija board lay. "Who wants to contact the spirit world first?" Sarah asked, her voice a mix of dare and delight. Mark, always the brave fool, volunteered, placing his fingers lightly on the planchette. "If there's anyone here with us, give us a sign," he declared, his voice echoing slightly in the cramped space. We waited, the silence so heavy it was almost its own sound. Seconds stretched into a minute, and I rolled my eyes, about to suggest we abandon this folly when the planchette jerked suddenly under Mark's fingers, gliding with an eerie smoothness to spell out yes. A collective gasp rose from the group, and Sarah's grip on my arm tightened. The room felt colder, the shadows darker, and what started as a game was quickly becoming something else, something unsettling. As much as my mind rebelled against the idea, the atmosphere in the attic was undeniably changing, charged with a palpable tension that even my skepticism couldn't dismiss. As the planchette ceased its movement, a heavy silence fell over us, a silence that seemed filled with whispering voices too faint to fully grasp. The chill in the air deepened, and I could see Mark's breath cloud in the dim light as he asked, "Who are you?" The planchette stirred once more, this time with purpose. It slid across the board with deliberate strokes, spelling out ELIAS. There was no recognition in any of our eyes, but the name hung in the air like a warning, a prelude to something sinister. "Elias, what do you want with us?" Sarah's voice trembled slightly, betraying her fear. The board was still for a moment before the planchette moved again, this time more rapidly, as if energized by our increasing fear. "Pact," it spelled out. None of us remembered any pact, and our confusion must have pleased whatever spirit we had contacted because the planchette started to move again, this time spelling out, "You forgot." It was then that small objects in the attic began to rattle, the lanterns swaying as if caught in an unfelt breeze. The whispering grew louder, forming coherent sentences that echoed around the cramped space. "You promised to remember, to tell my story," the voice hissed, melding with the shadows that seemed to creep closer towards us. Panic took root, and I felt a primal urge to flee, to escape the attic and its oppressive atmosphere. However, Sarah's fascination overrode her fear. "Tell us your story, Elias. We will listen," she whispered into the darkness. The room settled as if the presence had been waiting for that very capitulation. Though we were terrified, we stayed, bound by a mix of skepticism, fear, and curiosity. The session that followed divulged a tale of betrayal and murder, of love lost and vengeance beyond the grave. Elias had been a servant in this very house, wrongly accused and executed for a murder he did not commit. His last request to have his name cleared had gone unfulfilled, turning his rest into torment. As Elias's story poured from the board, the atmosphere in the attic shifted, the shadows retreating and the air warming slightly. But the sense of dread lingered, heavier than before, as if the telling of the tale had fed the spirit, giving it strength. We ended the session there, the echoes of the past too real, too raw to bear any longer. We stumbled out of the attic, the weight of Elias's story and our unwitting pact with him hanging over us like a shroud. In the days that followed, the presence of Elias haunted not just the attic, but each of our lives. Shadows flitted in the corners of our vision, objects moved of their own accord, and the chilling whispers became a constant, unnerving soundtrack to our daily existence. The nightmares were the worst, vivid replays of Elias's last moments, his pleas for justice echoing in the dark corridors of our dreams. Despite our fear, and perhaps because of it, we realized that ignoring Elias was not an option. His spirit had woven itself into the fabric of our reality, demanding attention, demanding justice. We gathered again at Sarah's house, a mix of determination and dread settling over us as we researched old archives and newspapers for anything that could substantiate Elias's story. After exhaustive searches, we unearthed the truth about Elias's wrongful accusation and execution. Armed with his story, we understood what we needed to do. Our next and final Ouija session wasn't like the first. This time, it was about giving Elias what he wanted, recognition and a chance to rest. "Elias, we have your story," I began, a tremor in my voice as my fingers touched the planchette. "You were wronged, and tonight we speak your truth to set you free." The planchette moved quickly, with an urgency that had been absent before. "Thank you," it spelled out. As we recited the details of his innocence and the real events of the crime he'd been accused of, a warmth spread through the room. The heavy air lightened, the oppressive dread lifted, replaced by a palpable feeling of relief. "Rest," the board spelled out finally, then fell silent. The aftermath of our encounter with Elias left a profound impact on all of us. The hauntings ceased, the shadows receded, and our nights became peaceful once again. However, the whispers never fully disappeared. Sometimes in the quiet moments before sleep, I'd hear a soft, grateful murmur, a benign reminder of our brush with the other side. I had entered that first session a skeptic, armed with disbelief and rational explanations. I left a believer, not in the generic tales of horror and specters that Halloween had promised, but in the stories of the spirits themselves, each etched with its truth, waiting to be told. Our experience with Elias taught me that some doors, once opened, might never be fully shut, and some stories, once started, demand to be finished. And while the whispers might have been a haunting at first, they now serve as a hauntingly beautiful reminder that even in the shadows, there is truth waiting to set us all free. The moment I set my foot inside the aged cedar cabin, a chill ran down my spine, an ominous whisper in the wind smothering my heart with an enigmatic dread. The cabin, lost within the creases of an old forest, stood as if it had sprouted from the ground, ancient and gnarled, like the trees themselves were keeping a solemn secret. This was supposed to be a weekend of Halloween fun. That was the plan, at least. But there, amid the quiet wilderness, surrounded by the skeletal arms of trees, it felt as though we'd walked into a forgotten tomb. I was the last to enter, hesitating at the threshold, while my friends, buoyed by youthful bravado and a car trunk's worth of beer, rushed inside. The plan was mine, a weekend away from college, a brief escape from the monotony of lectures and papers. The cabin belonged to my friend Mike's family, unused for years except by the occasional relic of family nostalgia. As we settled in, the flicker of the fireplace casting eerie shadows across the walls, Jenna, always the enthusiast for all things occult, pulled out a dusty Ouija board she'd found in the attic. The wood was worn, the letters almost faded, the planchette smoothly cold and unsettling to touch. "Let's kick this night up a notch," Jenna grinned, her eyes reflecting the fire's wild dance. Everyone gathered around, some skeptical, others curious, me feeling an unnerving pull towards the board as if invisible threads tugged at my soul. We began, our fingers lightly touching the planchette. "Is there any spirit here with us?" Jenna asked into the soft crackle of the fire. The air grew thick. The only sound was the wind battering against the window panes. Slowly, the planchette creeped towards yes. A collective, nervous chuckle circled amongst us, but there was a tangible shift in the air, a cold draft that hadn't been there before. The questions continued, each answer more unsettling than the last. The spirit claimed it was the widow who'd lived and vanished here, decades ago. Questions about her life and disappearance were met with vague, confusing replies. It was when Tom, skeptically asking for proof of her presence, directed a mocking jest at the board that things took a turn. The planchette moved with a vigor we hadn't seen, speeding across the letters. "Marcy knows," it spelled out hurriedly. We paused, glancing at Marcy, whose face had drained of color. Her secret, a truth none of us knew, spilled next. She had been secretly seeing Mike's brother, something she hadn't even told Jenna, her best friend. The air thickened with betrayal and shock. We should have stopped there. We should have read the signs, seen that some doors once opened spill forth shadows that are not so easily swept back into the darkness. But we didn't. The questions grew more daring, the night deepened, and somewhere, in the unseen, something waited. A waiting that felt like hunger. The room grew colder, the fire's warmth retreating as if afraid of the invisible force now among us. Whispers floated through the room, indecipherable yet unmistakably menacing. Though we all felt the presence, it was Jenna who first voiced the chilling reality. "Something doesn't want us here," she murmured, her voice just above a whisper. Ignoring the warnings prickling at the back of my mind, driven by a mixture of fear and fascination, I pressed on. "What do you want from us?" I asked. My voice steady despite the tremor of apprehension that threatened to betray me. The planchette moved swiftly, confidence in its motion that seemed to grow with each passing second. "Stay," it commanded. The atmosphere shifted palpably, the playful edge of our earlier interactions completely eroded. Mike stood up abruptly, knocking his chair backward. "This is messed up. We're just working each other up. It's just a game," he declared, attempting bravado, but his voice faltered, betraying his fear. No sooner had he finished speaking than a loud bang echoed from the upstairs, as though something heavy had fallen or been dropped. The tension snapped. Several of us screamed, scrambling from our seats. "That's it! I'm done," Marcy announced, her voice shrill, eyes wide and darting. Yet we found our feet rooted, a mix of disbelief and terror chaining us just as securely as any physical restraints. Compelled by a force I can't explain, I suggested we check upstairs, to debunk the fears, to prove it was just the house settling, just the wind. Our flashlights in hand, trembling slightly, we climbed the stairs. Each step creaked under our weight, sounding uncannily like faint, mocking laughter. At the top, the hallway stretched dark and foreboding, each door slightly ajar as if inviting us into the unknown. We reached the room from which the sound had emanated. Swinging the door wider, our lights pierced the darkness, revealing nothing more than an old, empty room with a wardrobe that had tipped over, its contents, a mix of old clothes and boxes, strewn across the floor. As we turned to leave, Relieved yet still uneasy, the door slammed shut behind us, plunging us into darkness. Panic ensued, everyone talking at once, trying to open the door which seemed to be held by an unseen force. It was only after what felt like hours, but were merely seconds, that we managed to force the door open and fled back downstairs, leaving the echoes of our own terror whispering through the vacant upper rooms. The line between our playful curiosity and the real terror that now gripped us had been irreversibly blurred. The fire that had been the heart of the room now seemed to watch us, its flicker like the mocking smile of an unseen spectator, enjoying our plight. Back downstairs, the air felt heavier, as if saturated with our fear. No one spoke. The Ouija board still lay on the table, the planchette ominously pointing towards goodbye. I suggested we formally close the session, a desperate attempt to restore normalcy and perhaps placate whatever we had roused. With reluctant agreement, we gathered once more around the table, our hands jointly on the planchette. "We wish to end this session," Jenna spoke firmly into the stifling air. "Go in peace." Instead of moving to goodbye, the planchette spiraled wildly across the board, a blur of frantic energy before it shot off the table and crashed against the wall. That was the final straw. The chilling message was clear. Whatever we were dealing with had no intention of leaving or letting us go. The room exploded into chaos, each of us shouting over the other, the sound mingling with the increasing howl of the wind outside, as if nature itself had risen in chorus with our panic. It was in the midst of this tumult that I noticed the old bookshelf swinging slightly, revealing a gap. Driven by an impulse I couldn't explain, I approached and discovered it was a hidden door. Inside, I found a small, dust-lined room that bore the distinct odor of decay and old parchment. There, amongst various antiquated objects, was an ornate diary bearing the name of the widow. Its pages told of dark pacts and forbidden knowledge, a grim testament to a soul forever bound to the nether. With the diary in hand, I returned to the group, the artifact serving as a grim centerpiece as we sat in a strained circle, flicking through its cursed pages. As we delved deeper, the story unraveled. A tale of the widow's descent into the occult, her dealings with an entity far beyond her control, and the pact she made, tying her spirit and those of others she would draw into this cursed place. Realizing we were the latest victims of this pact, we decided to attempt one final severing act. We burned the Ouija board and the diary in the fireplace, watching as the flames consumed them, hoping fervently that this would break our connection to the spirit. The fire blazed intensely as if it fought back, a shriek echoing down the chimney as the last of the pages turned to ash, a sound not of this world, a cry of anger, or perhaps of release. We left the cabin at dawn, the early light pale and uninviting, a stark contrast to the usual promise of morning. As we drove away, each bump in the road, each shadow from the passing trees seemed to whisper that it wasn't over, and it wasn't. Even now, back in the supposed safety of my everyday life, peculiar occurrences follow me. Glimpses of figures in mirrors, whispers at night, and an inescapable feeling of being watched. The diary's curse lives on, a shadow cast long and dark across our lives, a haunting reminder that some thresholds once crossed mark us forever in ways we never imagined. The moment I found the Ouija board hidden beneath a layer of dusty boxes in the attic, a cold shiver ran down my spine. Not from the damp chill that hung about the old house, but from something far more ancient, whispering through the dim corners of the room. My fingers hesitated over the ornately carved board, images of sunken eyes and twisted mouths forming in the wood's grain. It should have ended there, in that dusky silence. I should have left the board where it lay, forgotten. But curiosity, that relentless seducer, won me over. Later that evening, as the sun settled behind the hills and a mist rolled in from the east, our small gathering in the living room felt like the echo of a bygone era. The house, with its creaking bones and whispered secrets, set a perfect stage. My friends, Emily, with her comforting presence and intuitive eyes, and Mark, ever the skeptic, his brow furrowed in amused suspicion, watched with a blend of excitement and apprehension as I set the board on the table. I introduced the game with a lightness I didn't feel, recounting stories of my great-grandfather, a man known in his village for dabbling in what he called the esoteric arts. With each candle we lit, the shadows in the room grew longer, dancing across our faces as we settled into the game. "Is there anybody there?" Emily asked, her voice a mix of curiosity and reverence. Mark rolled his eyes but watched intently as the planchette trembled slightly under our fingers. At first, there was nothing. The planchette remained still, and I could feel Mark's growing urge to declare the whole thing a farce. But then, as if catching wind, it slid across the board with a purpose that stilled us all. "HELO," it spelled out, and Emily's breath hitched audibly. "Who is this?" I managed to ask, trying to keep my voice steady. The planchette moved again, more swiftly this time, projecting an urgency that seemed to suck the air thinner. EMMA. My heart stopped, an icy grip tightening around it. There was no way they could have known, no way at all. Emma had been my mother's name, a detail I had never shared with anyone present. As a heavy silence fell upon us, punctuated only by the flickering candlelight, I knew something had shifted. The playful air that had accompanied our start was gone, replaced by a growing dread that crept up our spines, whispering to us of unseen things lurking just beyond the veil of darkness that had begun to soak through the walls of the old house. We should have stopped, should have heeded the silent warnings all around us. But we didn't, and I asked another question, a question whose answer would come to haunt us all. "What do you want to tell us?" The answer, when it came, made my blood run cold. That night, after the candles had been blown out and my friends and I had retreated to our separate corners of the old house to sleep, the true consequence of our game began to unfold. The air felt denser, as if charged with a subtle electricity, and the darkness seemed to press against the windows with curious, peering eyes. I lay in bed, the sheets pulled up to my chin, eyes wide open, staring at the shifting shadows on the ceiling. Suddenly, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, slow, deliberate steps that paused before my door, then continued on. I held my breath, listening, but after a few long moments, the house fell silent again. The next morning, over breakfast, Emily confessed she hadn't slept well either. "I heard whispers," she said quietly, her eyes troubled as she pushed her food around her plate, like someone was having a conversation right next to my bed. But every time I turned on the light, there was no one there. Mark, who had scoffed at anything unexplained since we arrived, looked between us, his usual smirk faltering as he admitted to an unsettling coldness he felt during the night that no blanket could ward off. Determined to understand what we'd unleashed, I climbed back up to the attic. The air was stifling, heavy with dust and the musty scent of decay. There, among scattered trunks and forgotten portraits, I found my grandfather's journal, hidden beneath a floorboard. The pages were yellowed, the handwriting shaky, but the words chilled me to the bone. He wrote of binding a spirit, a malevolent force that fed on fear and sorrow. This spirit, he claimed, had plagued our family until he finally trapped it within a Ouija board, this Ouija board. With the journal clutched tightly in my hand, I reconvened with Emily and Mark. We pored over the pages, each word dragging us deeper into a past filled with dark rituals and desperate measures. It was clear then that we had disturbed something that should have remained locked away. We decided to seek external help, contacting a medium known for her experience with spirits. Her arrival at the house was punctuated by a sudden drop in temperature, a sign of the unrest stirred within these walls. She moved through each room with a practiced ease, her eyes narrowed, her lips moving in silent communication with the unseen. When she finally sat down with us, her expression was grave. "You have awakened the spirit your ancestor confined," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It recognizes your lineage, and it holds a grudge." The medium warned that the spirit would try to turn our fears against us, ensuring its release from the confines we had unwittingly loosened. Under the guidance of the medium, we prepared for the resealing ritual she believed would bind the spirit back into its wooden prison. As night draped its heavy cloak over the house, we formed a circle around the Ouija board, each of us clutching a token of personal significance, as instructed. Candlelight flickered, casting an ever-dancing shadow against the walls, the light reflecting the grave seriousness in each of our eyes. With the medium chanting in a steady, rhythmic tone, the air around us thickened, pulsing with a palpable energy that seemed to crawl along my skin. The temperature plummeted until our breaths materialized in visible puffs. Suddenly, the planchette twitched under our fingers, inching across the board with deliberate intent. The medium's voice rose sharply, her words slicing through the growing wind that howled through the room, despite the stillness outside. "Fear not what it shows you," she commanded, as the room bent with the shadows contorting into grotesque forms, each one playing on our deepest fears. Emily gasped next to me, her eyes wide with terror at the sight of shadowy figures whispering at her ear. Mark's jaw was set firm, his face strained as if resisting an unseen force attempting to pull him away. I felt the chilling touch of invisible hands clawing at my ankles, whispering deceitful promises. Using my mother's old silver locket as my token, I held it tight, focusing on the memories of love and protection it symbolized, channeling every ounce of willpower into the recitation of the ritual words we had been given. The wind screamed in defiance, the house shaking to its foundations, the shadows swirling faster around us, but we held the line, not out of bravery, but out of sheer necessity. As the final word of the chant echoed throughout the room, a shattering screech filled the air, and then, all at once, the shadows dissipated. The temperature began to rise to normal as the oppressive atmosphere lifted, leaving only the gentle flicker of candlelight and our heavy, uneven breaths. The medium, sweat beading her forehead, gave a weary smile. "It's done," she sighed with relief, her gaze meeting each of ours. "The spirit is bound once again, but let this house stand as a reminder. Some doors should never be opened." In the days that followed, as we repaired the physical remnants of that night's terror, the emotional and psychological scars remained much harder to mend. Each creak and whisper of the house now carried a weight of wary respect. We had looked into the abyss, and though we had closed its maw once more, the echo of its darkness lingered in our minds. This brush with the unknown changed us, wove its thread into our lives. We were survivors, yes, but also witnesses to the profound depths of unseen worlds, forever altered by the night we dared to ask, "Is there anybody there?" The house at the end of Latimer Street had always had a peculiar aura, one that whispered tales of deserted hallways and cold spots on bright summer days. We joked about it, dismissing the rumors as nothing more than fodder for thrill-seekers. That was until the night we found the Ouija board. My name is Jordan, a once staunch skeptic, now a reluctant believer in the unexplainable horrors that creep in the shadows. Along with my two friends, Sam and Riley, I ventured into what was supposed to be an amusing exploration of the supernatural with a hint of alcoholic courage and youthful recklessness. It was a stormy evening, the kind where the rain patters against the window panes in a steady, hypnotic rhythm, and occasional flashes of lightning momentarily brighten the darkened skies. Inside, the desolate attic felt even more detached from the world, stifling and cramped, filled with forgotten relics of the past occupants. Riley, ever the instigator, uncovered the dusty Ouija board beneath a pile of worn-out books and moth-eaten clothing. With a smirk, he suggested we give it a try. "What's the worst that could happen?" he had said, a question we'd later regret not pondering over longer. We set up our makeshift seance area with a seriousness that contrasted sharply with our initial skepticism. 3 candles flickered nervously as we sat in a tight circle, the Ouija board in the middle. Sam, whose fascination with the occult had always been a playful interest, was the first to place his fingers lightly on the planchette. "Is anyone there?" he challenged the silence, his voice a mix of derision and intrigue. At first, nothing happened. The anticlimax hung heavy in the room, our expectations slowly deflating. Then, as if pushed by an invisible hand, the planchette jerked towards yes. My heartbeat quickened, not entirely sure whether it was the thrill or the beginning of dread that caused such a reaction. "Who are we speaking to?" Riley asked, his voice now devoid of any mockery. The planchette moved again, this time with purpose, spelling out Evelyn. The candles flickered as if agitated, and the air around us grew inexplicably cold. "Did you used to live here, Evelyn?" I found myself asking, drawn into the unfolding mystery despite my reservations. The planchette's glide to yes seemed slower, more deliberate this time. As it stopped, a chilling draft swept through the attic, causing the candles to sputter briefly. The name Evelyn echoed in my head, a sorrowful reminder that perhaps some elements of those old tales were grounded in forgotten truths. It was then we heard it, a soft, sorrowful weeping coming from the dark corner of the attic. No source, no reason, just the sound of sadness trapped within the walls of this ancient house. The light-hearted adventure we envisioned suddenly morphed into a chilling intrusion into the unknown, the line between past and present blurred by a single, unsettling name. Evelyn. After the eerie incident in the attic, none of us could shake the sense of unease that clung to us like a second skin. Each creak and whisper of the house seemed amplified, turning our nights into an orchestra of haunting sounds. Despite the growing fear, curiosity chained us to the idea of continuing the sessions with the Ouija board. Each encounter with Evelyn peeled back layers of the unknown, revealing secrets and sparking more questions. One evening, driven by a masochistic need to uncover more, we gathered once again. The air was heavy, thick with anticipation. This time it was Riley who initiated the session. "Evelyn, were you harmed in this house?" His voice was a mixture of concern and dread. The response was immediate. The planchette darted across the board to spell murder. The candles flamed as if caught in a sudden draught, then dimmed, enveloping us in a tentative gloom. A picture frame slammed to the floor in the next room, the crack of old glass shattering the tense silence. Each of us stared at each other, the reality of what we might be dealing with settling in like the cold. Was Evelyn reaching out from beyond for justice or something more sinister? It wasn't just the physical occurrences that escalated. Psychological strains began to manifest. Nightmares invaded our sleep, vivid and disturbing. I dreamt of wandering through the house, following the sound of weeping that turned into anguished screams as I pushed through a door, only to wake up in a cold sweat before seeing the source. Sam confessed to dreams where shadowy figures whispered dark secrets in his ears. Riley, tough as ever, admitted to waking up feeling like someone was pressing down on his chest, leaving him gasping for air. The boundaries between what was real and the products of our agitated minds began to blur. Each session with the board seemed to intensify the phenomena, with Evelyn's communications growing increasingly cryptic and foreboding. She began to allude to a betrayal, a sin committed not by her, but one that resonated through the walls of the house, a wrongdoing tied somehow to Sam. Driven by a mixed sense of terror and need for answers, we confronted Sam. Under the flicker of the hallway's lone bulb, he looked different. The shadows seemed to cling to him more fondly, his eyes hollow with untold stories. With a voice that barely carried above a whisper, he revealed a truth that chilled me to the bone. His family had owned this house generations ago, a fact he had omitted. According to the family lore, something terrible had happened here, something that resulted in a hushed-up scandal and a hurried sale of the property. The trust I had in Sam wavered as he spoke, the pieces of a sinister puzzle clicking into place with each reluctant word. He was linked to this place, to Evelyn, more than any of us could have guessed. As he divulged his family's dark past, I couldn't help but wonder if bringing us here was truly an accident or part of a darker intent. The revelation of Sam's connection to the house cast a shadow over our subsequent meetings. Suspicion and fear intertwined, making each session with the Ouija board a battleground of emotions. One particularly stormy night, as thunder rolled over us like angry waves, we gathered around the board for what would unknowingly be the last time. This session felt different. The air was charged, heavy with the scent of ozone, as if the storm outside had seeped into the very walls of the house. Reluctantly, we placed our fingers on the planchette, a silent acknowledgement of the dread each of us felt. "Evelyn, what do you want from us?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The planchette moved quickly, more forceful than ever before, as it spelled out freedom. The lights in the room flickered as it moved, casting dancing shadows that seemed to lurk just out of sight. Then, as if drawn by the force of our fear, it moved again, spelling truth. Riley, who had always been the strongest among us, seemed particularly agitated. "What truth? What freedom?" he demanded, his voice breaking the tense silence. The response was immediate and chilling: betrayal. At that moment, a loud crash echoed through the house as the living room window shattered, the storm's winds howling into our sanctuary like a beast freed from its cage. The candles went out, plunging us into darkness, the only light now coming from the sporadic bursts of lightning outside, illuminating the terror on our faces. It was then that Sam broke down, confessing the full extent of his family's cursed legacy. His ancestor had been responsible for a terrible injustice against a young woman named Evelyn, who was wrongfully accused of witchcraft and murdered in this very house. His family had been haunted ever since, and he believed that by facing this past with us, he might somehow right the wrong and break the curse. The atmosphere grew denser, the storm's rage mirroring our own turmoil. We decided to perform a ritual, a cleansing that Sam's grandmother had once described, to put Evelyn's spirit to rest. Using an old family tome, we recited verses in the flickering torchlight, our voices steady despite the chaos around us. As we spoke the final words of the ritual, the house trembled, the wind screamed, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The calm that followed was not peaceful but hollow, as if we had emptied ourselves of more than just fear. In the days that followed, the hauntings ceased. No more whispers filled our nights, no more shadows followed our steps. But the bond between us had frayed, worn thin by secrets and doubts. I moved out at the semester's end, unable to walk the halls without remembering the terror and betrayal. As I left Latimer Street for the last time, I couldn't help but wonder if Evelyn had truly found her peace, or if we had merely silenced her torment. The line between liberation and suppression blurred, a lingering question that haunts me still. My skepticism may have been shaken, but the truth, it seemed, remained shrouded in the shadows of those old, whispering walls. 20 years ago, we found it amusing to ask the dark for a favor. Now it's coming to collect. The crisp scent of autumn had always been a harbinger of change, but that particular October brought more than just the shedding of leaves in our little college town. Back then, it was all about fleeting thrills, late-night stories, and laughs that echoed through the dorm halls. Tom, Sarah, and I were the usual trio, inseparable in our adventures and misadventures alike. It was Sarah who first suggested using a Ouija board that fateful night. Just something to liven up the evening, she had said, her eyes twinkling with the promise of mystery and, admittedly, a bit of mischief. None of us took it seriously when we drove out to the old Whitmore house, the one that loomed at the edge of town covered in ivy and rumors. We each harbored a skeptic's heart and a thrill-seeker's soul, a combination that would, unbeknownst to us, summon much more than we were prepared to handle. As we laid the Ouija board on the floor of that dusty, abandoned living room, our laughter mingled with the creaking of the old wooden floors. Candlelight flickered, casting long shadows that danced along the cracked walls. The air was musty, thick with the dust of disuse and the subtle scent of decay. It started as a game. It always does. But as the planchette began to move, jerkily at first, and then with a fluid certainty that stilled our laughter, a cold dread settled in my stomach. The candles seemed to burn a little dimmer as the keeper introduced itself through the letters on the board. The game ended with a pact none of us took to heart at the moment, entranced by the spectral atmosphere and the adrenaline of youthful folly. Return in 20 years, the board spelled out as our final agreement. We didn't understand the full weight of those words, nor did we see the shadows creeping along the edges of the room as we packed up, the echo of our promises lingering in the stale air. Years slipped by in a blink, life filled with careers, moves, and the occasional card during the holidays. I settled into a pragmatic existence as an engineer, my days defined by logic and concrete realities. That is, until the pact began to make itself known. I jolted awake one night to find my front door ajar, cold autumn winds sweeping in to scatter papers and whisper secrets. The walls bore symbols in a dark, sticky substance that I dared not touch, symbols that mirrored the faded symbols on the once hidden Ouija board. My heart raced as memories surged, the fear I felt that night returning with chilling clarity. In the light of day, under the unyielding gaze of the rational morning sun, I reached out to Tom and Sarah. Each call that connected bore the same mix of relief and terror. Relief at the sound of familiar voices, terror that they too recounted disturbances dark and inexplicable. "We need to meet," I insisted, my voice a mix of fear and command, and so the decision was set. We chose the quiet sanctuary of a small local cafe to reconnect, a stark contrast to the haunted vistas of our shared memory. As I approached the cafe, I noted Tom standing outside, his posture tenser than I remembered, his eyes darting around as if he expected the shadows themselves to spring to life. Sarah arrived, her usual vibrant self subdued, wrapped tightly in a thick scarf despite the mild weather. Inside, over steaming cups that none of us truly tasted, we vocalized the fear that had silently gripped us all. Something had awakened on the anniversary of that long-ago night. A thread pulled loose, unraveling the normalcy of our lives in whispers and shadows. "We have to go back," Sarah said quietly, her voice trembling not with fear but determination. "We need to end this pact, whatever it truly meant." Her words, though frightful, carried a weight that anchored us. We had inadvertently woven this tapestry of horror with threads of naivety and youthful disregard. It was our turn to unravel it. The journey back to the old Whitmore house was a quiet one. Each of us lost in our own tumultuous thoughts as the road unfurled beneath the tires like a dark ribbon. The house stood as we remembered, its facade more sinister with the wear of 2 additional decades. Ivy clung desperately to the brickwork, and the windows gaped like blind eyes into the soul of the forgotten. We hesitated at the threshold, the weight of our impending actions pressing down like the heavy air before a storm. Sarah was the first to step inside, her resolve stiffening her spine as she crossed into the shadow-filled entryway. Tom followed, his usual humor replaced by a grim set to his jaw. I closed the procession, a hollow feeling in my gut as I stepped over the familiar threshold into the past that refused to remain buried. Our footfalls echoed in the empty rooms as we made our way to the heart of the house where our pact had been sealed. The setting sun filtered through the broken windows, casting elongated shadows that twisted as if in warning. The room was colder than the rest of the house, as if it remembered our last visit. We set up the candles in a small circle, the same as before, and placed the Ouija board in the center. The planchette was cold under my fingers, colder still as it began to move with a familiar purpose. It wasn't the hesitant, stuttering motion from 2 decades ago, but confident and deliberate. "Welcome back," it spelled out, and the simple greeting ran down my spine like ice water. The keeper was quick to establish control, its presence in the room palpable. As it had promised 20 years ago, it now demanded the fulfillment of the pact. The air thickened, the shadows deepened, and we realized that something far more malevolent had anchored itself to that room, to the board, to us. It began with Tom. Whispering voices filled the corners of the room, growing louder as shadows coalesced into the form of a small, hunched figure that darted just out of sight whenever he tried to focus on it. Tom's laughter was hollow, forced as he tried to deny the fear gripping his heart. But his eyes, wide and darting, told the true story of his terror. Sarah was next. The temperature around her dropped suddenly, her breath appearing as mist in the air. Figures appeared in the periphery of her vision, faces of long-lost loved ones, twisted into expressions of sorrow and pain. They reached for her, their hands passing through the air inches from her skin. Their touch felt as an icy wind that made her gasp and recoil. My ordeal was no less petrifying. Beneath my feet, the floorboards began to creak and shift as if something beneath was trying to break through. I could hear a faint heartbeat, growing louder, as though the house itself were coming alive. The sound clawed at the edges of my sanity, threatening to pull me into an abyss of madness. For hours, it seemed, we endured our private hells, each confrontation designed to chip away at our resolve. But as I stood there, surrounded by the very fears I had tried so hard to forget, a spark of defiance ignited within me. I remembered the words of the pact, the promises we had unwittingly made, and I knew that survival meant confronting the nightmares head-on. Gathering my courage, I stepped toward the center of the circle, the planchette trembling under my fingers as if it sensed my resolve. "We are not yours to keep," I declared, my voice steady. The shadows recoiled as if struck, the whispering voices faltering. It was our turn to press the advantage, to reclaim the spirits stolen by a childhood folly. Standing firm in the decaying room, surrounded by the oppressive darkness of the old Whitmore house, I felt a surge of adrenaline. The shadows seemed to hesitate, quivering at the edges of the room as if unsure of their next move. My heart was pounding in my chest, not just with fear but with anger. Anger at the spirit who named itself the Keeper, who tried to ensnare our lives with terror. Sarah and Tom rallied beside me, their own fear giving way to a shared determination. Their eyes, once filled with terror, now burned with the fire of resistance. We had come to break a pact, but first we had to revisit the depth of the nightmare it had caused. I laid my hands flat on the Ouija board, feeling the planchette pulsate like a living thing under my touch. We did not understand what we promised, I admitted to the dark, but we won't be bound by it any longer. The room felt colder, if that was possible, and the candles flickered as though struggling to maintain their light. The spirit, whether out of anger or desperation, intensified its haunting. Tom's shadowy tormentor rushed towards him, but this time he stood his ground, facing it with a courage that seemed to suck the strength from the specter. Sarah's icy visitors wailed, reaching for her with frost-bitten fingers, but she set her jaw, staring them down as their forms dissolved into mist. My own floorboards ceased their threatening rumbles, the heartbeat fading into a desperate, distant thumping. I could almost hear the frustration of the Keeper, its tools of fear losing their grip on us. As the atmosphere in the room began to shift, the planchette moved once more, spelling out a reluctant acknowledgement. Freedom granted. The oppressive atmosphere lessened, the shadows retreating as if being pulled back against their will. We didn't wait for another word, hastily grabbing the now inert Ouija board and hurrying out of the house. The night air felt surprisingly warm after the chill of the haunted room, and the stars twinkled above us, indifferent observers to the human drama that had unfolded beneath them. We stood together outside the now silent house, watching as the first light of dawn began to touch the sky with hints of orange and purple. The world felt different, as if we had walked out of a long dark tunnel into the brightness of a new day. "Are we truly free?" Sarah asked, her voice quiet in the still morning. "We're free of that pact," I responded, still feeling the weight of our experiences. But maybe we're never really free from the fears we don't face. Tom looked between us, the corners of his mouth turning up in a wry smile. "Then let's make sure we face them," he said, a note of the old humor returning to his voice. We parted ways as the sun climbed higher, each of us carrying the scars of the night, but also a profound new understanding. I walked back to my car, feeling the eyes of the house on my back, but knowing that its power over us had been broken. We had confronted our darkest fears, and though the marks of that night would never completely fade, we had reclaimed our lives from the shadows. In the light of day, I allowed myself a small smile. It was, after all, a brand new day.